There's something about Europe that seems to irritate a lot of people, especially world leaders. Not just the usual suspects like Russia and China, but also voices in the US, parts of the global south, and even within Europe itself. It's not that they're all launching attacks or issuing threats, but there's a pattern of frustration, mockery, and rejection. Something about Europe just gets under other people's skin. In this video, we're not just talking about the European Union. When we say Europe, we mean the wider group of democratic countries that make up the European space. That includes the EU, but also countries like Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, and yes, the United Kingdom. Despite Brexit, the UK remains part of Europe both geographically and politically in many key areas. It's part of the same economic orbit, faces the same strategic threats, and shares the same democratic values. Together, these countries form a region that is generally rich, peaceful, democratic, and strangely controversial to many Americans, Chinese, and Russians alike. Even though Europe doesn't try to dominate the world like in times past, a lot of countries treat it like a problem. In this episode, we'll try to unravel that paradox. Europe isn't a superpower in the traditional sense. It doesn't run the world's biggest army. The few nuclear weapons France and the UK have aren't offensive in nature. It doesn't go around toppling governments in wars of its own making. But it still has power, just a different kind. It sets rules. It builds systems. It sets an example. And that quiet, indirect power often makes other countries, including the US, uncomfortable. Europe's economy is massive, home to more wealthy consumers than any other continent. Its companies operate around the globe, and its rules on trade, the environment, data, and safety quietly shape how the rest of the world does business. A company in the US or China that wants to reach European customers often has to adjust how it operates. And when governments strike deals with Europe, they usually face conditions too: commitments to human rights, democracy, or environmental protection. If you got this far in our video, we'd be honored if you hit that subscribe button. Once we get above 100,000 subscribers, YouTube helps shield our channel from the dangers of hackers, phishing, and other threats. So we'd be really thankful for your help. Part of the reason for the Europe hate is cultural. Europe is deeply tied to a certain idea of what modern societies should look like. Public tax-funded healthcare and education, free elections, independent courts, and strong consumer protections. It's a model based on compromise, slow change, and rules that apply to everyone. That doesn't mean that it is perfect. To people in Europe, this makes sense. But to many leaders elsewhere, especially strongmen and dictators, it looks like a challenge. Because when Europe says, "This is how we do things," it can sound like, "This is how you should do things too." And for authoritarian governments, or even more traditional democracies with very different values, like in example Orban's Hungary or Donald Trump's USA, that feels like pressure. They see Europe as moralizing, arrogant, or stuck in the past. That's especially true in countries like China and Russia. The Kremlin views Europe as a threat, not only because Europe is rebuilding its military at a pace Russia can't hope to match, but because it proves you can be rich and free without controlling everything from the top down. And that's dangerous to Putin's whole story about needing a strong hand to avoid chaos. Russia's hate towards Europe is especially visible among the so-called Russian elites. As Putin's foremost puppet and previous president and prime minister Dmitry Medvedev recently put it, "Brussels and Europe today is a real enemy of Russia. The European Union is no less of a threat to us than NATO." He frames Europe, not just its military buildup due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but its democratic values-based model, as hostile to Russian interests. The same contempt of Europe can be seen in China too. Beijing doesn't just see Europe as a trade rival. It views Europe's values and democratic influence as a significant ideological challenge. And Europe holds economic power over China like no other continent. In 2024 alone, the wider European democratic space imported more than €530 billion worth of goods from China, making it China's largest single export market. Those imports accounted for around 20% of all European goods imports, while only about 8% of Europe's exports went back to China. That trade imbalance, roughly 300 billion, gives Europe a major strategic lever. Meanwhile, at a tense EU-China summit in mid-2025, China's Commerce Ministry voiced its strong dissatisfaction and resolute opposition to European sanctions targeting Chinese firms linked to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. European leaders have warned that Europe cannot stay completely open to Chinese trade, especially the flood of online shop imports, if European companies don't get fair access to China in return. Nearly 20% of China's exports go to Europe, but only about 8% of Europe's exports go the other way. If trade broke down, it would be much harder for China to replace Europe as a customer for its higher-end products like green energy equipment, electric cars, and cheap electronics, because these are mostly sold to rich countries in NATO, plus Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan. Europe, on the other hand, could replace its 8% export loss much more easily than China could find a new market for 20% of its exports. Even in the United States, Europe's longtime ally, there's a kind of eye roll that's become more common, especially among the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, but also in Democratic circles. Europe is often mocked. To them, it stands for everything they say is wrong with liberal politics: regulation, environmental laws, taxes to pay for welfare, and human rights. Trump has called the EU an enemy on trade, claimed Europeans are freeloaders in NATO, and accused them of taking advantage of the US economically and militarily. And perhaps worst of all, Vice President J.D. Vance, famous for his rumored love of furniture and makeup, dismissed America's allies, who often sacrificed just as much per person in Afghanistan, as nothing more than random countries with no fighting experience. But most of these talking points fall apart if you scratch the surface a little. Take defense spending. Yes, some European countries have historically spent less on the military. But since Russia invaded Ukraine, defense budgets across the continent have surged, especially in countries like Poland, the Baltics, Germany, and the Nordics. NATO is stronger, not weaker, and European troops are deployed across Eastern Europe, holding the line. Not only that, but as we discussed in our video on what American wars cost Europe, it has showed up time and time again for America's foreign wars, and as a result carried the brunt of the cost from migration as the Middle East faced crises after crises as a result. Or take the idea that Europe is declining. MAGA voices love to talk about European weakness, but Europe's quality of life, public health, education, and innovation consistently rank among the best in the world. People want to live here. Companies want to invest here. The idea that Europe is falling apart is more culture war fantasy than fact. The growth in Europe has been near constant, except for some dips, since 1960. Take the World Happiness Report as another example. It measures GDP, quality of life, and overall happiness. The US now ranks behind 13 European countries, having dropped 8 spots since 2023. By that measure, it's the US, not Europe, that seems to be slipping compared to the rest of the Western world. Nowhere is the gap between MAGA claims and reality more obvious than with Ukraine. Trump and his allies have repeatedly claimed that Europe hasn't done enough to support Ukraine, that the US is carrying the burden. But again, the numbers tell a very different story. According to multiple sources, Europe has actually delivered more total support to Ukraine than the US, especially when you count military aid, humanitarian help, housing for refugees, and long-term reconstruction funding. If you look at these statistics by GDP, the US doesn't even make the top 10. Poland and the Baltics have given huge shares of their defense stockpiles. Nordic countries are delivering advanced systems. And across Europe, millions of Ukrainian refugees have been given shelter, education, and healthcare, no questions asked, and often overlooked when the statistics of the aid is counted. Countries like Germany and Poland house over 2 million Ukrainian refugees alone, which dwarfs the 200 or so thousand housed in the US, And that is before you even consider the 2 million more seeking refuge in various other European countries, like the Czech Republic, which has the highest quantity of Ukrainian refugees per capita in the world. Beyond budgets, Europe also feels serious military strength, which is often downplayed. Combined, the countries of democratic Europe maintain around 1.7 million active duty troops, more than the 1.3 million currently active in the US. And across NATO, once you include Turkey and Canada, the NATO figure climbs past 2 million without the US. While some argue that armored warfare as we know it is over, a combined doctrine still has a place for agile armored vehicles. European countries operate around 4,300 tanks, compared to about 5,600 in the United States. In the armored fighting vehicle department, Europe operates a far more modern fleet of APCs and IFVs than the United States, with a well-balanced mix across a wide range of models, from the Swedish CV90 to the German Puma and Boxer and the French VBCI and all the models in between. Together, these are estimated at about 6,000 of the roughly 12,000 in NATO's total arsenal. On the naval side, Europe operates a combined 1,500-plus warships, including several aircraft carriers, amphibious assault ships, submarines, and destroyers. While the US Navy is still unmatched in scale and global projection, Europe's fleets provide real regional power, especially in the North Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Baltic, and it is still by far the world's second-largest navy. The numbers don't lie. Europe is no slouch. No matter what J.D. Vance or Pete Hegseth claim, it fields more active duty troops than the U.S., thousands of tanks, hundreds of warships, and rising defense budgets across the board. The U.S. still dominates global power projection, but outside of France and the U.K., who maintain overseas territories like the Space Launch Site in French Guyana and the Royal Air Force's base in the Falkland Islands, most European forces focus on defending the continent. And here's the kicker. Almost every European NATO member now meets or exceeds the older 2% GDP defense target, with several already outspending the US per capita. So when MAGA-aligned voices talk about Europe as a freeloading patchwork of weak allies, the facts tell a different story. These democracies are investing in their own defense, seriously, structurally, and steadily, and as it stands, outmatch all other opponents on the world stage outside the US. As of today, I'm struggling with understanding how an over-leveraged US is going to get to the 5% goal set by Donald Trump, while the Baltics, Poland, and the Nordics seem likely to reach that goal much faster than the US without breaking the bank. Even though rhetoric from various other international leaders paints Europe as decadent, morally posturing, and a liberal hellscape, Europe still matters. Its market is huge. Whether in trade or diplomacy, countries often adapt to European regulations and standards, even as they mock them. That's why Europe creates tension. It exerts influence not by force, but by expectation, not by gunpowder, but by consistency. That's not to say that Europe doesn't have its own share of problems, among others, the fragile nature of open democracies, where Russia and China can fund disinformation campaigns, where the US Republican Party can try to influence elections via the CPAC, or where some countries are still not willing to up its defense spending even after a very collective push. But as Winston Churchill once said, no one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. And as promised, the links to the other videos we mentioned are in the description and comments. Have a great weekend, everyone.